Vanderbilt School of Medicine, as well as a Master's of Public Health from Johns Hopkins. His research and writing focuses on improving care and human connection in health systems, including how to best incorporate their beliefs and values of patients and clinicians into clinical care. Our second speaker today, Dr. Karl Elliott, is professor in the Center for Bioethics here at the University of Minnesota, and he has a joint appointment in the Department of Philosophy. He holds a PhD in philosophy from Glasgow University, as well as an MD from the Medical University of South Carolina. He's written 7 books, including White Coat, Black Hat, Adventures on the Dark Side of Medicine, and Better Than Well, American Medicine Meets the American Dream. The format for today is that Dr. Tilburt is going to first speak on the topic, followed by Dr. Elliot, and then we're going to allow plenty of time for questions and answers after that. So would you join me in welcoming them here today?
Good morning. Please stand by. Or I should say good afternoon. How's that? Let me check this one while I'm at it. All right. Pleasure to be here. On a Sunday evening in 1999, barely awake, I sat in a church pew and heard these words. Do you like who you're becoming? Now, I didn't get to church much during my internship. I had some other things going on. I was training in internal medicine at the University of Michigan in a college town at a university medical center. And I happened to have a free moment where I could actually go to church. And this question woke me up and has stuck with me for nearly 20 years now. Do you like who you're becoming? Well, today I want to examine that question in a little more detail with you with 3 words, 2 claims, and 1 question. The 3 words are simple. They're in our title for today. Moral, formation, health sciences. I take the health sciences to just be social practices in a distinct context that have an explicit mission of discovery and application of new knowledge, and that are typically secular, a-religious, and committed to some sense of common knowledge. Formation, I mean, is a process whereby something is shaped. A substance is shaped, and in this case, human subjects are shaped, typically towards some goal, and usually have some purpose in mind. It has religious connotations, but it need not, and in fact, there's a literature now that talks about professional identity formation. So the word formation is out there, and I want to use it in particular way today. And then by moral, I just mean the norms that guide us in our everyday life. Somewhat different than ethics, which we could talk about, but the norms that guide us in our everyday life, and they imply either praise or blame when we do or don't follow them. Okay? 3 words. So here's my first claim. Training in the health sciences is best described as moral formation. I think this is the most fitting term for being trained in the health sciences. And by health sciences, I mean nursing, medicine, public health, any number of the applied disciplines, even probably biochemistry or biomedical engineering, any of the applied disciplines that we call the health sciences. I think it's a better term than education, which hopefully will be obvious to you by the end of the talk today. Now, why would this be an interesting claim that training in the health sciences is moral formation? Seems kind of intuitive, but why would that be interesting? Well, it implies that there's a human substance that's being shaped, and it implies that there's a goal of shaping human beings toward a certain purpose. But too typically, we ignore those aspects of formation when we talk about training in the health sciences, which we'll talk about. Typically, in our secular understanding of the university and the academic health sciences, we're about knowledge and application of that knowledge to public health, for instance. But I think formation's a better word, and I hope that'll be obvious by the end of our discussion today. Here's my second claim. Careful observation of the realities and routines of training in the health sciences show divergent assumptions about reality. I just used a lot of big words there. What I mean is, we say one thing, which may very well be true, but there's a whole lot more going on in the usual practice of the health sciences that isn't always readily apparent in the education, but is nevertheless forming its trainees in a particular way. So I want to be very clear with some examples here. There's a said reality of medical training and the lived reality of medical training. And we need careful observation of both to understand what formation is actually happening in the health sciences. So the said reality is a rational process of conveying information, very cognitive, technical, focused on curriculum, and includes passing along and discovering knowledge in very formal ways, like getting grades and taking courses and doing different rotations and learning techniques, to ultimately discover and then apply new knowledge, right? That's the said educational process of academic health sciences. But I would propose that if we carefully observe the practices of academic health sciences, there's a lot more going on there that equally forms and shapes a certain way of life for people engaged in it. And I say that as a person who is myself engaged in the academic health sciences. I see patients every day. I write papers. I do research projects. I go to faculty meetings. I attend all the stuff that people have to do, and have done so for 20 plus years. But there's all sorts of lived realities that are somewhat more irrational, much more embodied, involve desires, consumption, hidden curricula, living, relationships, power, exhaustion. Sound familiar? Anyone? Conflict, culture, and all sorts of other things, like the incentives that drive our everyday behavior in the academic health sciences. And when you get to the faculty level, things like promotion, funding, and self-preservation end up being some of the functional goals of your day-to-day living, as much as anything so grandiose as improving public health, right? I'm not saying any of these are wrong. I'm saying these are the realities of how people live and operate. And I think most of these things can be done with high integrity or with less integrity. But we first have to own the fact that there are all sorts of embodied practices that ends up forming us in the academic health sciences. So this is, I think, is largely an empirical claim about what's actually going on in the training of health professionals. You could call the said reality a kind of pedagogy of cognition, whereas the lived reality is more like a pedagogy of desire, where we're trained to want certain things. I never knew I wanted a career development award until I was told I should want one, right? Until the incentives and the messages of the environment in which we place ourselves convince us that that's what we should desire, right? Both of these are equally important realities I think we need to account for through careful observation. So let's take an example. This is a screenshot from my laptop. It's a financial disclosure for a colleague's grant. Okay? So this is one of the very many mundane, routine social practices in academic health centers that people have to engage in order to continue doing what they do. These are routine, mundane, repetitive forms that people follow to engage in a certain kind of social practice in social life. And we think it still matters in terms of the ultimate ends of the research, but we have to engage in these things in order to keep going. You take an online module, you sign a disclosure, you attest to something or other about your financial relationships, and you proceed with those financial relationships, but with the good conscience that you told everybody about it. Right? So I would like to propose to you that practices like conflict of interest disclosure are not just the annoying residue of academic health sciences. They are annoying, but they're not just the annoying residue, but they're actually revealing vignettes into a certain worldview, a certain culture of a context and of a social practice, with a vision of what it means to thrive or flourish in that practice. Some of those assumptions are explicit, some of them are implicit. These practices, I would propose to you, over time have a forming influence that could be described as a kind of secular liturgy. And by liturgy, I mean a repetitive form that's repeated, usually through language, over and over to shape an identity toward an end. Okay? Certainly it doesn't have the same sort of religious character through standard religious institutions, but I would say it still embodies a certain vision and a goal of life and what it means to live well. And in a sense, it's compelling worshipers to follow in a certain path. So, those are my two claims. Got through my words, my claims, now my question. So my question is, so what now? What if that's true? What if you followed me and maybe you have concerns that there's not a great connection between the said and the lived realities of academic health centers? What if we might want to wonder together about how to make academic health centers more healthy, more thriving, more honest about the many different dimensions of what it is to thrive in that context? Or maybe we just need to own the fact that we have a view of a vision of the good life embedded in daily practice in academic health centers. What then? Well, that's where I really want to start a conversation with you and start wondering out loud. And I'm not going to answer that question today, but I want to wonder out loud with you about the contexts, the communities, and the practices that we all engage in every day that subtly and over time form us. I'd like us to think, as we ponder that question, about the physical, the local, and the relational as key dimensions of reclaiming, I think, a more robust understanding of how we might want to respond to that original question that I raised. Do you like who you're becoming? And as we contemplate that, I'd like us to wonder about our pace, our space, our face, and our place. The pace of what we do, the spaces in which we do them, whether we're engaging with faces at all, or whether it's just an inbox, and the places and contexts that we do our work. There's a lot more to talk about there. I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you for your attention.
All right, different kind of sermon, much darker one. My father died about a year ago this month. He was a family doctor in a small town in South Carolina. Solo practice sort of completely last of the breed. He was still practicing into his 80s a few years ago when he got, sort of bizarrely enough, Legionnaire's disease. And the Legionnaire's turned into sepsis. Sepsis turned into a very long ICU stay on a ventilator. And that ICU stay turned out to be the first of many. But he survived it kind of miraculously, and even more miraculously, rehabbed himself back to his baseline over the next 6 months or so, and lived another 3 years, mostly good years. But he did have a lot of acute problems during those 3 years, which led to many other hospital stays and in other medical units. So my brothers and I and my mom all got a sort of secondhand view of what it was like to be a patient in ICUs, long-term acute care, acute rehab, subacute rehab, various hospital wards, pain clinics, nursing homes, coronary care, and many others that I won't name. And during all those times, there were a few episodes that have kind of stuck with me over the years and keep running through my head. I was actually just back down in South Carolina. I got back yesterday, so a lot of these episodes are things I've been thinking about just recently. So one was during that last ICU stay a year ago, the one that eventually killed him. And I can remember that my uncle was there. This is my father's brother, Methodist minister, retired Methodist minister. And at one point, this was mainly just to, get out of the ICU waiting room and clear our heads for a little bit. He and I left the hospital and took a walk. So this was North Carolina in February, so it was like 60 and sunny and beautiful outside. And when we were walking, my uncle said, Karl, there's something I've been wondering about with your dad. He said, all these years, I've always thought medicine was kind of like, a brotherhood or a sisterhood that, it was kind of like being in the police, like being a police officer, that all your fellow police officers kind of had your back, if you're in the club. He says, but, I haven't been able to see a trace of this in your father's care these past 3 years. To all these doctors, it seems like he's just another 85-year-old guy on his way out the door. I don't think they even know what he did for a living. So that's one thing that stuck with me. Here's the other one. This was actually during his very first ICU stay. So he was unconscious on the vent for a couple of weeks, and during that first week, they decided they needed to put a feeding tube in. And one evening in the hallway outside the ICU, my mother and I ran into the gastroenterologist who'd put the tube in. And so we introduced ourselves, and my mother, who was very proud of my dad and what he did, said to the GI guy, my husband practiced family medicine for 56 years. And that GI guy just paused for a minute and he said, "I'm only 45 and I'd quit tomorrow if I could." Which wasn't the response my mom was expecting, actually, when she told him that. She was actually so stunned that she just stood there a few seconds with a kind of frozen smile on her face. And it was very awkward. To be honest, though, it kind of made me like the guy, the GI guy, because it was the kind of thing I could imagine myself saying back then. I can remember when my brother finished medical school. He was in medical school 2 years behind me. And so he finished in 1989, and I remember him saying, "I wonder how long it'll take for me to turn into a human being again." And of course, the answer we were both afraid of was maybe never. Now, you know, I think there are a lot of things to dislike about medical training. I think we could, you know, go down the list, the kind of authoritarian institutional structures, the kind of culture of conformity, the kind of anti-intellectual atmosphere. You know, Tolstoy said, "Every happy family is alike, but each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way." And I think you could say the same thing about medical schools. I actually thought the culture here at the U was pretty good for about the first 10 or 11 years I was here. That was before the scandal in the psychiatry department around the death of Dan Markingson, which I was very involved in. That became public in 2008. And during the 8-year when that scandal was a public issue, there was not a single doctor at the University of Minnesota who was willing to speak out publicly on behalf of Dan Markingson's family. There's not a single doctor who signed a petition to the governor, not a single doctor who signed the letter to the faculty senate. Thousands of other people did, including a lot of university faculty outside the medical school. Some doctors at the VA signed, but the doctors at the U lined up uniformly to a person behind the administration against the family of the dead man. So why is that? I've got my own theories. Let me try to give you some numbers, though, that might shed some light on this. So these come from a study presented at the annual conference on research in medical education in 2010, and that were later published in Academic Medicine. So this was a survey of over 5,000 faculty members in 26 American medical schools. So very large survey, representative survey, and fairly recent. Here are some of the things it found. Over half of academic physicians said, quote, "The administration at my institution is only interested in me for the revenue I generate." 31% said that their institution actively discourages altruism. Nearly half said that they were considering leaving their current jobs. Almost a third said that they were going to leave academic medicine altogether. When they were asked, "Do your values line up with the medical school where you teach?" over half said no. And just in case you're wondering how things could have gotten that bad without somebody speaking out about it, 30% agreed with the statement, "I am reluctant to express my opinion for fear of negative consequences." So that's that last statement is the one I want to kind of highlight here. I am reluctant to express my opinion for fear of negative consequences. So the take-home message from this survey is the majority of American medical school faculty members feel that their institutions don't share their values, that they're only interested in the bottom line, and nearly a third say they can't say anything out loud about it because they'll be punished for it. So how does that play out? I told you I was getting dark. It'll get darker. Let me finish with just another story. So a couple years ago, I started teaching this new seminar in the Honors College for the first time. It's a course devoted solely to medical research scandals. It's like a 24-hour scandal channel, all scandals all the time, 2 a week for an entire term. Pretty much a nonstop display of exploitation and abuse. And one thing that we do in the course is look at those notorious scandals of the 1960s and 70s, the one that eventually finally drove the United States to set up a formal regulatory system, a system of research oversight. So the Tuskegees, the Willowbrooks, the various prison scandals, and so on. And so after teaching this course for a term or two, I started thinking to myself, you know, we would look at the scandals themselves. Started to wonder about the aftermath. You know, whatever happened to all those doctors who were in charge of these notorious scandals? Were they punished? Were they sanctioned in some way? Were they disgraced? Well, no, not exactly. In fact, just the opposite. So this is Dr. John Cutler. He was the Tuskegee syphilis study researcher who was involved in it, but also defended it for decades afterwards. I think until he died, actually. And then later it was discovered that he also conducted the Guatemala syphilis study, the one that President Obama apologized for in 2011. So what happened to him? Well, he was named department chair and then later acting dean at the University of Pittsburgh. And when he died, there was a named lectureship for him in his honor. This is Saul Krugman. He's the NYU pediatrician who fed hepatitis A virus to institutionalized disabled children at the Willowbrook School on Staten Island. What happened to him? When he was exposed, he was elected president of the American Academy of Pediatrics. This is Albert Kligman. You may remember him. He's the University of Pennsylvania dermatologist who said when he looked out at the prisoners at Holmesburg Prison, what he saw was, quote, acres of skin, like a farmer gazing out on a fertile field. Gave 75 of those prisoners the toxic chemical in Agent Orange in exchange for $10,000 from Dow Chemicals. What happened to him? Honorary degrees in Holland and Germany, and he was elected president of the Society for Investigative Dermatology. This is Eugene Sanger. He's the radiologist at the University of Cincinnati who was funded by the Pentagon to give massive full-body radiation to 88 cancer patients without their consent in order to figure out how soldiers would respond to radiation exposure in the case of a nuclear attack. In 1994, the Radiological Society of North America gave him its highest honor. And then there is Chester Southam. Some of you might remember him from The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. He's the one who injected live cancer cells into prisoners in Ohio and then later elderly patients at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital in 1963. What happened to him? He was elected president of the American Association for Cancer Research. So let me just finish by saying, I know what you're thinking. That's all in the past. Things are different now. So let me just leave you with one final slide, which is the response to Dr. Charles Schultz. I just mentioned the Dan Markingson case. Dr. Schultz was chair of our Department of Psychiatry during the Markingson scandal and a co-investigator in the study in which Dan Markingson died. What happened to him? Well, as you would expect, as the scandal grew, so did the awards. I think I'll leave you there, and maybe we can take questions together.
All right, so we have some time for questions now. I might start out with a question I'm wondering if you could link this to John's talk about formation, sort of formation in institutions. Do you see these abuses as, or what would lead you to think these are sort of, there's an institutional process of formation creating this kind of context in which these abuses happen, rather than it just being sort of bad human nature?
You know, I agreed with pretty much everything John said. And if you were to ask me, how is it that in all of these notorious research scandals, why is it the case, one, that nobody, or only rarely does anyone speak out about them? Why are there so few whistleblowers? And when they do speak out about them, why is it so rarely doctors who do it rather than someone else? And first I would point to the results. The fact is, when it does happen, the whistleblowers are punished and vilified, and the people who are responsible for the wrongdoing are rewarded. In that sort of cultural context, why would anyone speak out? I mean, essentially what we say is, if you speak out, your career is over, you will be destroyed, and if you do these things, we will defend you and reward you. I mean, we can talk about what specifically it is about academic medicine that produces this. I don't think academic medicine is unique in this way, because if you look at whistleblower studies from other fields, engineering, government, the corporate world, and so on, you also see whistleblowers being punished. But I do think that it's particularly striking how rarely doctors in this situation actually do the right thing. Do you have thoughts, John?
I guess I would just say that we'll limit it to physicians. Physicians are human too. So I think that part of the challenge here is acknowledging that we are actually operating on assumptions about human beings that we've sort of ignored in the health sciences for our very efficient operational technical reasons, and to our peril, when we should just assume that humans entering that social practice are susceptible to all the things that Stanley Milgram and theologians and everybody else have told us we're susceptible to. And it's an environment of incentives and responses to fear and reward, like lots of other environments.
Yeah, and deference to authority. I mean, that, to me, having gone from medical school to graduate school in philosophy, one of the things that really struck me is how just sort of strictly authoritarian and hierarchical academic medicine is compared to many other places in the university. And I think as long as you've got that kind of military-like deference to the authorities above you, and are expected, even encouraged, sometimes even demanded, to submit your own conscience to that of the person above you in the hierarchy, then doing what you think is the right thing is going to be very difficult. I think it's a question of how easy or hard we make it for people to do the right thing.
What questions do you have for either of them? And we're not going to be able to get a microphone to you, so if you could just maybe state your question clearly, and then if one of you could restate the question over the microphone so we can pick it up with the camera.
So, you talked a lot about the issues or the problems that we're facing, but what do you see as possible solutions to these problems? Like, how do we start fixing these things?
Karl's got the solution, but he's holding back. So I want to, my short answer for that is Hogwarts for healthcare. And I'm dead serious. So Brian and I have had these conversations, but I think we need to actually restructure the social life of medical training around in my world, master clinicians who are identified as upstanding members of their moral communities, who then become essentially the house parents for trainees who cohabitate together and learn together and make mistakes together and embody a certain social life together. And they have to share a vision of the good in order to do that. But that's my short answer.
Isn't that what we have already? I mean,
Yeah. So we have embodied practices that implicitly share some view of the good, but I just think it's an impoverished view of the good, I guess. And so I think if we're a little more honest about what I need to train people in a particular identity to live out that identity and do it on a sort of a more mentorship model. I don't think it solves all the problems that we're talking about in terms of relationships. I'm thinking probably more clinically here, but I think we're approaching a threshold where the great sort of larger than life people you would look up to, kind of clinical mentors that we used to think about in our medical training, are harder and harder to find, and our lives are so sort of fragmented and not cohesive. And we used to have house staff. The term house staff doesn't even mean anything anymore because people are just intersecting shift workers. So we've gotten what we've asked for in terms of industrializing healthcare. And you'd have to fundamentally reimagine the social life of medical training, I think, toward an end that we all agree is good. And maybe that's just grandiose. But.
yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that for the most part. I think I would be far more destructive in my comments. I mean, you got to tear the whole thing down and rebuild it.
Yeah.
I think that, but the difficulty is that those kind of things are easy to say. That, it's kind of like saying, how would you fix the American healthcare system, or how would you fix the tax code, or any kind of institution that just has centuries of tradition behind it. One of the things, you mentioned Milgram. So everybody remembers the Milgram study, in which under the conditions of the study, people were willing to obey orders to turn electrical shocks up to a lethal dose, at which they believed that they were killing other people, possibly. 65% in the Milgram study. What people don't remember, and the Milgram study is about deference to authority. What Milgram thought was that this was essentially illustrating a natural tendency that we are socialized into, which is to defer to anyone that we see as a legitimate authority. He said, you go into a theater, you do what the usher says. You go into a classroom, you do what the teacher says. You get on a plane, you do what the flight attendant says. Because in each of those cases, we see that particular person as a legitimate authority in that situation. One of the things that people don't seem to look at in the Milgram study are the follow-up studies he did, in which he manipulated conditions such that people were willing to listen to their conscience rather than the man in the white coat. And the most striking thing that he was able to do as far as changing the conditions of the study were to introduce dissent. So if there was just one guy in a white coat saying, turn up the voltage, please, 65% were willing to do it. If there were two men in white coats, and one of them was saying, I don't know if we should do this, this is looking bad, 0% were willing to. And if the subjects were accompanied by other subjects who refused, they were much more likely to refuse as well. So the message from this is what it takes to resist authority and follow your conscience is solidarity. You need to have some sense that you're not acting completely alone in this situation in your protest and dissent. So whatever we do as far as Hogwarts for medicine, it's got to involve that kind of sense of solidarity, some sort of changes whereby people who feel as if something's really messed up is going on here don't feel as if they're the sole person who has to speak up and object.
I'd like to say thank you, Karl. I've followed your work for a long time. I think you're a voice of dissent at the university that has been very valuable. It's the transparency and the light cast on things doesn't certainly win you accolades or even friendship from an administration. And I think both of you you're both identifying something that I have a clinical faculty involvement over a number of years, but I've also worked in large organizations, and both of the large organizations, healthcare organizations, and the academic medical center, the unspoken motto or the unspoken mission statement is, we're not happy till you're not happy. And it really, and I know that people don't mean to do that, but there's all kinds of reasons. But I think what you're describing and what you're shedding a light on, I think John down at Mayo and doing other things is saying, here are some things that we could do together to try to figure out how to stand against it. And I really think that solidarity thing you're talking about maybe is the community that John's talking about.
Yeah. A question for you, Dr. Elliott. Why do you think that protect your own mentality, which seemed to be so strong in the cases of the medical scandals, was absent when your father was ill?
Could you restate the question?
So the question is, why did the solidarity that was there in the medical scandals disappear in my father's care? It's because he was in the bed rather than standing beside the bed of the doctors. As soon as you change positions and you're the patient, it's all gone.
I've not heard the word Hippocrates mentioned. That's our covenant of loyalty to patients first. All the scandals you talk about were exactly not having the patient's interests first. They were somebody else. The Soviet Union had it fixed so the state came first. Our current commercial system has the corporation interests come first, and doctors are willing to take a bribe not to order care. It's called value pay. Now, how are you going to fix the system that we're criticizing here if we've forgotten the Hippocratic oath?
I'm going to repeat the concern, which is it appears that we've forgotten the Hippocratic Oath either in serving the interests of corporations or the state or self-interest as opposed to those of the patient. That obviously is the fundamental question, I think, that probably transcends both of our discussions today. Whether the answer is getting everybody to say the original Hippocratic Oath again, I'm less confident about. In part because pluralism is a reality, and in part because you sort of can't unring certain bells in our cultures that even when you say it, it doesn't, more Hippocrates in our setting brings more hypocrisy about any sort of Hippocratic tradition that might still persist. I'm sympathetic to, very sympathetic to a deep understanding of a patient-centered ethic for healthcare. Whether we ground it in Hippocrates or in something else, we could have that conversation. But I think you've identified the fundamental challenge that we're all trying to kind of grapple with.
I may look old, but I'm actually young enough to have gone to medical school at a time when ethics was taught in medical school, medical ethics courses. And I was not a fan, to be honest. And part of it, to me, seemed that the ethics stuff was all, just sort of lip service, and nobody really bought into it. But if you wanted to figure out what was really going on, rather than what sort of, what the hidden curriculum was, rather than the actual curriculum, you need to actually see the way people behave. One of the things that really struck me, I went to an unusual Southern liberal arts college that had an honor code. And by honor code, I mean like a serious honor code, Davidson College. And for 4 years, I never had a test proctored. I scheduled my own exams. We were often given exams and told, take this home, don't look at a book, time limit is 45 minutes. Nobody ever would have thought of cheating. It actually worked. People were so intent. It was something that from the day you started at Davidson, you were sort of indoctrinated into the belief that this was the most important thing about the college. And I can remember being struck when I got to medical school, where every exam was rigidly proctored. You had to present IDs for many of them. The doors were locked. People couldn't get in. And, the thing that struck me was that you're being sent two different messages here. The message when I was in college is, we know that when we're not looking at you, you're doing the right thing. And the message in medical school was, if we don't watch over you carefully, we know you will do the wrong thing. It's two very different views of the kind of person that you are. And it affects the way that you behave dramatically. If I were ever inclined to cheat, which I never have been, but if I were, it would have been in medical school, not at Davidson.
There's a question here.
A question for John. One of the things you had mentioned in your idea of how to improve our moral foundation that we are getting in our medical training is to identify those standout examples of morality as well as clinician work. I guess one thing that I have a concern about with that is already in medicine, we're elevated as above and somewhat untouchable compared to the rest of the population, that we are physicians. There's the weight that's applied with that. And by pointing out even the best of the best people and say, this is who you want to be like, we're kind of saying that they're infallible in some points. And that puts a lot of pressure on them. Instead of having a culture that we're able to say that, yes, everyone makes mistakes, and in our ability to admit our failings, we're able to create a better culture that supports patients when things have gone incorrectly to them, and allows a culture to not lock down its doors and fight against other people, but willing to work through it with them and admit fault. In what ways would you see that fitting into the moral foundations?
You've raised a lot there. So the question was, how do I envision this actual sort of apprenticeship model when there's still those kind of larger than life figures create more sort of sense of maybe lack of self-efficacy that I could never be that good, or on the other hand, the bigger you are, the harder you fall, and everybody has mistakes, and so maybe we'd never get to a point where we could actually admit our own weaknesses. I think you're raising a lot of important operational questions. I would probably step back and say I haven't worked out all those details. My concern is that when we sidestep a view of what we actually think we mean by leading a good life, and we avoid things like bodies and desires, we cannot appropriately account for and expect to get a good result in the training of health professionals.
So I rotted half of my teeth on one side of my mouth that intern year because I chewed on peppermints rather than eating meals. Because delayed gratification is part of the ethos of what it means to train in medicine, right? I wasn't given another model, or I was ignoring the better models that were there. So I just think we need a more communal, embodied, and robust sense that we are frail, broken human beings to start with, and we shouldn't hold ourselves up to perfection, but we should hold ourselves to a sense of commitment and improvement together. And I think we do need those models of people who have worked through difficulty and on the other end can say this was a good life. And I have mentors in my life who I can say I want to be like them. Not because they're perfect. But if we don't really have those models out there, I just think we're going to have more and more problems in a very industrialized kind of clock in, clock out kind of model of healthcare that's going to be more sad sooner.
I thought I saw a hand over here, but maybe not. Jim?
Do either one of you see a pronounced public health or a health provider response to the gun violence culture that we have now? I mean, is that, and if not, why not? Why isn't there a public health response from health providers and public health officials on something like gun violence?
I'll give you a very institutional response. My professional society, American College of Physicians, has recently come out has published statements, has published guidance on this. What is and isn't part of the clinical encounter and what constitutes a health risk factor is always obviously up for discussion. And it is debated by many people. I think it's a natural function of a lack of shared understanding of the common good that is a general feature of our society. But I don't have a brewing commentary beyond that.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's often a mystery why there's no response to a lot of different things that seem like moral atrocities in American life. I will say that one of the most thrilling events that I can remember in recent years is this response from the high school students in Florida, just that righteous anger that has emerged, and the willingness to call out these gutless politicians on a national stage and humiliate them. I love it. We should all do the same.
If I could get maybe one parting question here. So my question is advice for current healthcare students. So what, given these challenges, what should a student in the health sciences be doing, both to sort of be attentive to the way that they're being formed and shaped, the sort of implicit formation that's going on, but then also they're not in a position to right now to be able to fix any of these structural institutional questions. So what kind of practical advice would you give them for moving things in a right direction, if only for themselves and their friends? One answer would be to step out, but assuming they feel a vocation to remain and to be a faithful presence in this area, so what would that look like?
I'm the last person to ask for advice in this regard. One thing I would say is if you find yourself alienated and uncomfortable by medical training and the things that you see going on, hang on to it. Hang on to that alienation because it's a sign It's a sign that something troubling is going on. I think the bad part is when that feeling of alienation and discomfort goes away, because then you're lost. But as long as you can hang on to that and realize that there's a possibility that alienation is the correct response, then there's still hope for you.
This is a whole separate talk in some ways. I would say don't isolate. Pay attention, and honestly, give care and attention to your own body, and pay attention to what your needs are, so that you can not go numb to your surroundings and your culture. Because the more you treat your body like a machine, the more your awareness of your moral constitution gets machine-like in its calculations. And then I think we're bordering on subhuman in our professional life.
Would you help me thank our speakers today?